So we've all been sentenced to the same planet together, so it's really nice to share with my holy brothers and sisters, and thank you for your time. But what I've done is I've broken the class into three parts. That way you know and you can run out and get more popcorn or whatever. But the three parts are, I'm calling the first part a reality check, which is kind of what Hanukkah is not, and really about sort of more of what it is. The second one I'm going to call the holiday itself, where we're going to go into some practical ideas, but to really understand on a much deeper spiritual level how, because as we talked about in the last class, I know that you guys probably reviewed all the notes from the last class, so I'm just going to just build from there. But how everything is, there's no such thing as spiritual, there is no such thing as physical, there's only oneness, and there are various levels, which we call spiritual and physical, like we use the analogy of hot and cold. There is really scientifically no such thing as cold, but when you walk out Montreal in the middle of January, you don't say you're absencing heat. You say you're freaking freezing, because that's how we relate to light and dark, spiritual and physical. But really, there's only heat in the absence. Really, there's only spiritual, and when it becomes physical eyes. So because of that, I want to show you how the physical expression of the holiday has a very deep spiritual impact on the soul through its performance. And then the last thing we'll do is really jump into some maybe very deep stuff. It's all very deep, I guess, but maybe more obviously deep, which is the message of Hanukkah. So, having said that, I know you guys got a little sneak peek on this, but I do want to share with you, let's see here. Start off, I thought maybe we would start off a little bit with what Hanukkah isn't, right? So, I mean, the more I was going around on Google and I'm finding this little blue Hanukkah Harry going, oi, as opposed to joy to the world, and all these various things, especially the classical idea of Hanukkah bush, menorah man, somehow suggesting that Hanukkah is this idea of these very powerful warriors, and what we're commemorating is some sort of, that we have this tremendous physical power and so on. These are cute, they're fun, but they are really a distraction from what Hanukkah is truly all about. So on a very simple level, we're going to start on planet Earth and wake our way up. By the way, this is also what Hanukkah is not, but I thought it was so cute I would stick it in there. Can you read that? I think the subtitle was like Hanukkah updated, but I don't know, maybe like today is the only way a kid could possibly even understand the concept of Hanukkah, but certainly it has nothing to do with what Hanukkah is all about. Hanukkah is a story, which I kind of took this picture because it has a mythological look to it. It also has that kind of ye old biblical look, which I'm not a big fan of, but I just kind of thought it was kind of cool. But at least we'll start with this. The simple idea of Hanukkah, of course, is it surrounds itself around the family that were known as the Hashmonayim. We're going to talk more about that name later. I'm not sure where they were later called the name of the Maccabees. I mean, maybe they found out they weren't really Jewish, they were Irish, so they added the Mac part. Like maybe there was a guy named Donald, and sometimes he became Irish, became MacDonald, so this was like Macbees or Natubees. But their biblical name really is the Hashmonayim, and maybe I will share it now. The Hashmonayim comes from the word actually oil. And maybe that was because their name became adopted based upon the fact of the miracle of the oil, which we'll get to later in the class. But these were, of the three types of Jews, there being the priests, the Levites, and the Israel, this was a Kohanic or priestly family. In fact, that was led by the high priest. That's the gentleman you see holding the Torah in his hands, and that's the, although an incorrect image, it's supposed to be the breastplate which he wore. Actually, the breastplate had 12 stones, each one representing one of the 12 tribes, and they used to actually glow in different forms, giving messages, almost kind of like computer style. But that's really what it was a family against all odds that led an incredible revolution, and we're going to see a little bit later, it was not a battle against the Greeks. So we'll hold on to that idea, but what I love about living over here on this side of the planet is, oh sorry, we're not quite there yet. This family, as you can see here, Judah, or Yehuda as we would pronounce it, Yehuda Maccabee, he was the father or the leader under Matisyahu Maccabee, who then took over the reign, although his brother Simon later became the main power, and that's why the tradition continues on down through him. But it is kind of interesting to note, because if you're a little familiar with the history of the land of Israel, which is why I put the circle over here, you'll see that through this family ultimately comes Herod, who was the great builder who built or I should say rebuilt in the most beautiful manner, the Second Temple. And just a little interesting point about the history was there was a big problem with the Hashmonaim, even though they were the heroes of Hanukkah in Judaism, which is almost kind of in a way where the American founding fathers got this idea. There are different bodies of judicial control of the country. So you kind of have like your Senate or Congress, and you have on the other hand your presidential, and you have your Supreme Court. So this is based upon actually Talmudic biblical Jewish thinking, except the three parties where you have the king, which would be like your president, which some people might say is very much like your president. But there is an idea of the kingship. There is the idea of the great, instead of it being called the Supreme Court, we called it the Sanhedrin. And then there's also the idea of the priestly family. Now, not one was allowed to be the other. So the fact that the priestly family, the Kohanim, the Maccabees, the Hashmonaim, became the king of Israel was in itself a very controversial issue. And some people say this is why it led to the ultimate downfall, because if you noticed here, Herod, his line actually comes through his wife, because in fact Herod was actually a slave. He wasn't even Jewish, and he took power through a massacre of all of the last of the Hashmonaim when he was able to take over control, which is why if you see here that it continues now from Herod, because there were no longer any of the Hashmonaim alive in that particular time and day. And this is what I was going to say before. This is why it's kind of cool when we look at that here. This kind of makes it a little bit more real. This is about 15-minute drive outside of Jerusalem. If you notice here, they have the Maccabean graves. That's probably where the Irish Hashmonaim were buried. And then over here, you have the Hashmonaim graves or village. But many, actually, this is what it says here up in Hebrew as well. Kvarot HaMaccabeim is the Maccabean graves. This symbol here probably is where aliens landed, but we're not going to go that way. But the idea really is that I find it kind of incredible, because when you start to look at what's going on here, these are the caves. These are burial houses where the graves of the Maccabees or the Hashmonaim were actually found. And they've begun, as you can see in this upper picture here, I'm not sure if you've seen the arrow as well, but this was the entrance to the Hashmonaim village, which is now currently being resurrected, rebuilt through different archaeological groups. And that's what I always kind of find cool, that, you know, you have that image that I showed you before, which, as I said, is mythological, but the truth of the matter is that these images are the images that really kind of make it real. I mean, here it is kind of in stone. It's not mythological. It was kind of a story of something that really happened in real time. And I just kind of thought that might be a sort of interesting introduction to sort of bring it down to earth. But what I want to go a little bit deeper into the historical and social background, again, we're going to just keep working this higher and higher, and I mentioned this before, is that the battle of the Jews for Hanukkah was not against the Greeks. In fact, I'm going to share with you several teachings of our Talmud, which will show you that, and again, this is the sad point of not understanding Hanukkah correctly, that Jews and Greeks had an incredible love of each other. They totally adored each other. In fact, the beginning of the relationship began when Alexander the Great arrived in Israel. And there were many efforts of the enemies of Israel to try to convince him that he needed to conquer and to destroy Israel. And the high priest at the time, this is all in the period of the Second Temple, was a gentleman called Shimon HaTzadik, or Simon the Righteous. And Simon the Righteous set out in the middle of the night. This is all, the Talmud tells this entire story in Shkalim. He set out with a whole group of people that were carrying torches coming down from the Judean mountains, which is where Jerusalem sits. And as they began to approach the Greek encampment, Alexander came forward to greet them, and when he saw Simon the righteous, it says that Alexander got off of his horse and bowed to him. And of course, everyone was shocked. And when asked why, he said because every time he fought a battle, the image of this man came to him, and that's when he would know he would win his battles. And of course, that is the nature of the high priest, is that the high priest's job was not to pray just for the Jews. The high priest's job was to pray for every human being created by God. And as God's will unfolded, it received the blessing from the high priest. So that immediately created a relationship. Now, the Greek-Jewish relationship in the times of the Second Temple were 180 years. And during that period of time, the Talmud says, for example, it refers to the Greek language as a very beautiful language. In fact, the Talmud even says, according to one of the great rabbis, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, that Greek could actually be used for the writing of holy scriptures, which could not be used in English. For example, I mean, people might have to, but let's say, for example, when reading the book of Esther on Purim, technically, really, it needs to be in the holy language, in Hebrew. The only possible exception to that is actually Greek. And in fact, there's other opinions in other Gemaras, like the Gemara in Shabbat, that discusses possibly that Greek could even be used in the writing of all, even the Bible. Even though we're going to talk about the Bible being translated into Greek when things went south or started getting bad, it just shows this incredible relationship. In fact, the Gemara even talks about the use of the Greek language in the Jerusalem temple and speaks about it on a very high level. I'm going to just throw this out as a little side point. It's something that we could do a whole class on if you ever want. But there's an amazing Gemara of a debate that took place between the wise men of Athens and the wise men of Jerusalem. And the range as it develops starts from very practical kind of discussions that affect people and society and social life, and culminates into some of the most esoteric concepts. But I just sort of highlighted a few of them because I thought it'd be fun to hear what it was that the Jews and the Greeks were fascinated to hear each other's opinions on them. And so one of the beginning questions were asked, what should a man do if he's rejected in his offer to marriage? He comes to a woman, he proposes to her, and she says no. How should a man behave on such a level? That was like the kind of warm-up question. It then moves to what should a person do if he has a tendency to constantly lose his money? How can he break his mazal, his bad luck? How can he change? You know, you're not supposed to laugh on that one. It's a bad sign. Muffle it. But so how does a person deal with something of that kind of karma, bad karma, if you will? But then, again, I'm just jumping. There were numerous questions. It jumps into a middle level, which is, how do you build a house in the sky? Where is the middle of the earth? Can you drag a well of water into a city? And then going over, skipping many other questions that came in before, the final question is, if a baby chick dies while it's still in the egg, how does the soul of the chick exit? So these become the platform through which each side was able to extrapolate and present a whole approach to their thoughts on wisdom on all kinds of multiple levels. But the point I'm just trying to make here, and it's really important to understand this, is the actual love affair that happened between the Jews and the Greeks. In fact, there are, even until recently, some of the greatest rabbis throughout history are known by the name of Alexander, because that was in tremendous love and respect to the wisdom of the Greeks. Unfortunately, what happened was, after Alexander died, and a little while after that, you probably know this history, the Greek Empire began to crumble and to fall apart, and it became the Hellenists, more the Assyrian Greeks, that began to, who Israel was under their jurisdiction, but it was controlled by Athens. But once Athens lost that control, it was the struggle between the Assyrian Greeks and the Jews, which ultimately would lead to the Battle of the Maccabees. In fact, one of the 5 fasts on the Jewish calendar is called the 17th of Tammuz. And what it commemorates there was a horrible moment where now under the Assyrian Greek rule, they burnt a Torah in the temple and placed an idol actually in the Holy of Holies. That was like one of the major things that began to deteriorate. There was also under King Ptolemy, who was the Assyrian Greek leader at the time, who forced 72 rabbis, which was a tremendous miracle. He forced each one locked into their own cubicle that they would translate the entire Torah into Greek. Now, the reason we view that as a tragedy is you have to understand this clearly, because if you go back to when Joshua was splitting the Jordan River and crossing into the land of Israel for the first time, the first thing that they did is they made these enormous blocks, 12 blocks, and on each one of these blocks, the 10 Commandments were written in the 70 languages of all the people in the world. Because although God gave the Torah to Moses and the Jewish people, it's not just for it's for all of the world. So the question is, if it was immediately translated and made open to the nations of the world, why was this a problem having it translated into Greek? And the answer was because the nature in which it was done under the coercion actually froze the meaning. And this is why many times if people study Bible in languages other than the holy language, although they might be able to extract certain concepts and ideas, unless a person really understands the nuance, as is always the problem in any translation, of the Hebrew, much of the teaching actually becomes lost, especially when a person moves beyond the superficial and goes into the much more esoteric. There was another tragedy as well, as that during this time, the influence of the Assyrian Greeks became so powerful on the Jews that many of the Jewish people began to abandon their faith and their adherence and became Greek. And that's why actually even in the wars of the Maccabean, I don't know if this is well known, but it was a civil war as well. There was a tremendous amount of battling that was going on between the Greek Hellenized Jews and the Jews that had remained loyal to the teachings of Moses. In fact, what's a little interesting about this is many people talk in modern day Israel about the Yom Kippur War. Well, there was actually a Yom Kippur War prior to this. The first Yom Kippur War was actually fought when the big battles of the Maccabean against the Greeks began. One of the statements that the Greeks wanted to make was to be able to, one of the statements that the Maccabeans wanted to be able to make was to make an attack deep inside Greek control. And they actually battled in Antioch. I put the map here so you can get an idea of how, I mean, you see Damascus isn't even halfway. Give you an idea of how far this attack was. But the Maccabeans launched the beginning of the war after the initial Jerusalem battle, which I'll get to in a minute. They actually went as far as fighting in Antioch, and that battle was fought inside of, or on the day rather, of Yom Kippur. So with that as a background, the question then becomes, what actually is the holiday of Hanukkah? So in Hebrew, the word Hanukkah means Chanukah, or Chanu 25. Chanu means to rest. So the word would actually be translated as the rest of the 25th, meaning that the day that the battle ended was on the 25th of the month of Kislev. That was the day that the war ended. Now, as a little side point, maybe it's not a little side point, but it's an important point, the merit of the success of the battle, interestingly enough, and that's why I said it's not about all these macho guys going out there with their, Maccabee man and so on. The success of the battle was attributed to a woman named Yehudit. Yehudit had been raped by the governor of the Greeks in Jerusalem. And when in this evening, she then cut his head off and ran through the streets holding his head. Now, for the Assyrian Greeks, their leader was a kind of a pagan god. I mean, we know the Greeks were very involved with pagans, but the Assyrians were even more so. They made humans into gods. And when they saw the head of their leader, this was the panic that went through their army that then was the impetus for the Maccabeans, the Hashmonaim, to step forward. And it's also interesting to note that if you look, all of the major holidays in Judaism, including the holiday of Purim with the story of Esther, and even in the merit of Passover, are always attributed to the woman. Because in Judaism, the woman is considered the more evolved, the higher elevated creature of the two. I mean, if you want to use technology terminology, she's the 2.0, right? First there was the male, and then there was the improved version called the woman. I always have a problem with the English because woman sort of sounds like it's a name which is built upon a man, like, whoa, man. You know, I always have that. I don't know if you guys remember Harpo Marx when he sort of leaned against the sign said woman, but he leans against the W-O, and like some men accidentally walk in and then they come out clobbered by the ladies. But woman is not a secondary to man. She is the improved version of the human being. And so therefore, since redemption is ultimately associated with the woman, did we talk about this in our last class? I don't want to go too far off on it if we did. Doesn't sound familiar?
No.
Okay, so the word for mother in Hebrew is aim, which is spelled Aleph Mem. Aim is, if you look, you have the idea of Aaron and Moshe. Those letters spell mother. That was the first redemption. Then you have Esther and Mordechai. That's the second redemption. And then you have the final one, Elijah and Messiah. That's aim. It's all about that evolution. Anyhow, I'm going to finish the PowerPoint and then go back live. But I wanted to just say that the first things after the success on the 25th of the month of Kislev, the first thing that the priests did is they came, as you probably know the story, but I'll go over in case you're not familiar, they came running into the temple and they lit the menorah. Again, I just thought this was like a nice little taste of realism. These are ancient coins, and you can see the 7 points of the menorah, but these were coins found in the time of the Hashmonaim, because the Hashmonaim created a state of Israel now that the Greeks had been completely removed, and as such, the first thing they did was they printed their currency. It's also interesting to note that in those days, the symbol of Jews was much more associated with the menorah rather than the Star of David. But that's kind of like an interesting kind of a visual, which I sort of wanted to just point out there. Let me just, excuse me 1 second, we'll get out of this. Okay, hello. So now the question is, and I'll just run through the story in case you're not familiar with it. The priests, the Hashmonaim, they come running into the temple. Everything had been desecrated. They wanted to show that the light of the temple could be revived, but all of the jars of oil had been contaminated. And miraculously, they were able to find one little jar that was buried underground, and it had the stamp or the seal of the high priest, and that little jar would be enough oil to burn for 1 day. Now, in Kabbalah, the metaphor or the idea of this one little jar is hinted at, actually, we read this in the Torah recently, when Jacob is fearing the approach of his brother Esav. He moves the entire encampment on one side of the Jabbok River, but he remembers that he forgot one little jar, which he goes back for. And when he goes back for that, he fights the angel of Esav, which is through that transformation of being able to beat the angel of Esav, his name is changed from Jacob to Israel. And that idea of that transformation is hinted in something metaphorically about this jar. Now, this little jar of oil and the symbolism of the high priest is that every human being is a temple. Okay, good, we have 2 temples on this side. But really, every human being is a temple. And inside of our temple, in fact, each one of the vessels that was in the temple is each one of our organs. For example, there is the Ark. I'll start with that because everybody saw Raiders of the Lost Ark, so you're probably familiar with it. But in the Ark are the 2 tablets that Moses had, or Mel Brooks's version of the 3, but ultimately 2 also. So you have those 2 tablets. Those are the 2 ventricles that sit in the heart. So the Ark was the heart of the temple. The 2 tablets are a metaphor of that. The menorah was 7 candelabras. That represents light. Light is associated with wisdom. This is why you have 2, 4, 6, 7 openings, because these are the openings through which the light come in and through which the light comes out. And we spoke about this last class, that the idea of light and sound are one and the same, but we're not going to go there again. But this is the idea of the 7 holes of the menorah. In fact, the nature of the menorah is that it had, again, the menorah as opposed to Hanukkah, which we'll get to later, the menorah had 7. The wicks of the 3 right and the 3 left sides were tilted to face the middle candle, and the middle candle was facing the north, because in Hebrew the word north, tzvon, means hidden or dark. And therefore the menorah sat in the south, which is an idea of light and wisdom, and its light pushed into the darkness of the north. So all of them came to the center. And if you think about it in a way, you have three pairs of twos, which would correlate to the 2 sides of the menorah: 2 ears, 2 eyes, and 2 nostrils. And the very middle is the mouth, because that which is unique to the human being is the ability to speak, is the medaber, the one that can communicate holy ideas into a physical world. So therefore, while these are primarily function of input, this is a primary function of output. So therefore, wisdom is always understanding both sides of an issue until one can resolve that and bring it to its equilibrium. That's why the first letter of the word shalom, peace, is the letter shin, because the shin also has 2 extremities which meet in the center line, and by resolving the resolution of 2 different sides, it's never about one against the other, right? I always say, look, we're in the middle of elections over here, and all my right-wing friends and left-wing friends, I always say, have you ever seen a bird fly with only 1 wing? You need left and right to be able to fly. So you need to understand that instead of seeing things as opposites, you have to understand things as the 2 sides of a whole. And that's this ability to be able to bring that equilibrium to that balance, and that's the wisdom which metaphorically represented the idea of the menorah. We're not going to go down more into the rest of the vessels in the temple, but that was the first place they wanted to come, was to relight this candle and therefore bring that light out. And the symbolism of the little jar represents something very interesting. The word for an evil person in Hebrew is called a rasha. It's spelled resh, shin, ayin. The outer letters of this word, resh and ayin, spell the word evil, ra. Resh ayin is ra, evil. But the inner letter is divine light. And it comes to teach us that no matter how bad a person is, no matter how evil a person is, as long as a human being is alive, there is something deep inside of them that connects them to holiness. And therefore, the challenge is, when addressing a person who you might have a problem with, or feel difficult, or really see that they're a bad person, instead of focusing on that external shell that they've used to isolate themselves from the unity of mankind, if one focuses only on their inner essence, ultimately they will find buried in that person that little jar of oil which can be lit and can illuminate and totally transform a person into the divine being that we are all meant to be. This is the preciousness of life, and this is something we need to always focus on, never to stigmatize, never to speak gossip about another person, because all that is a distraction from always seeing a person's inner beauty. And by seeing that inner beauty, you will be able to light that candle inside of themselves. That's the symbolism of the little jar. But here's an interesting question that comes up. What actually was this miracle of Hanukkah? So there are 2 schools of thought. One school of thought was, since they only had enough oil for 1 day, and the process of making kosher oil took 7 days, that's why they would have a window of 8 days till they had new oil to come in. One school was, they put all the oil into that menorah, and it burned miraculously for 8 days. Okay? Really, then, if that's the case, the holiday should only be for 7 days. Because the first day was no miracle. There was enough for the first day. The only miracle was day 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So another school of thought was, they put an 8th in each day. Right? You know, Jews, we always like to do this, right? So they put an 8th in each day. And the idea would be that at least there would be some sort of token lighting that would happen. But the miracle was every day burnt a full day long. So the Talmudists come along and they say something very interesting. They tell a story of a great rabbi who was known as Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. It was just a few minutes before Shabbat was coming in, and his daughter came running and crying. And she says she's made a terrible mistake. Instead of filling the Shabbat candles with oil, she accidentally put vinegar. And she knew that there wasn't enough time to switch it, and she had blown for the family the idea of lighting Shabbat candles for that particular Shabbat. And so her father, who was a great mystic, said, no problem. The same God that makes oil burn will make vinegar burn. And so he lit the candles with the vinegar, and of course the way the tale goes is not only did they burn, but they learned all the way until Saturday night through the entire Shabbat. But the concept is really a very deep concept. And this kind of ties into the fallacy of thinking of the Hashmonaim and the Maccabean as being great physical soldiers. And this is a very deep story told about Samson. We all know Samson and Delilah. We call his name Shimshon. But Shimshon, there are two midrashim that describe Shimshon in two very bizarre, different contrasts. One says Shimshon was like a little teeny Woody Allen. Nothing. The other one describes Shimshon as being so massive in his chest that we use a measurement called an amot, which is usually the distance from the elbow to the top of one's finger, that his chest was so massive it was 60 amot wide. Now, just imagine in the middle of this class right now, somebody comes in the back door, goes, hey, and everybody turns around just for a second, and he's gone. Well, if I asked everybody in this room, somebody might be able to identify a little this, little that, but you're not going to have a contrast of him between like looking like Woody Allen or Hercules on steroids, right? Everyone's going to have like some sort of a similarity. And here it wasn't guy just popped in. Shimshon, Samson, was the leader of the nation. So what is it teaching us? It's teaching us that physically, he had no physical power. He was a scrawny, weak little person. But he understood a miracle. He understood that to do this is absolutely impossible. The only way to do this is because God allows it to happen. And not when a person understands this intellectually, but when a person understands this in their bones. This is the way they live and understand life. Then a person like Shimshon, Samson, could be as thin as my finger, but have the enormous power to even be able to pull down the building as we know at the end of his life with the Philistine and so on. And this was the same idea what Hanina was talking about, that one can live inside the world of nature, and the world of nature will perform accordingly. But one has the ability to break through the laws of nature by understanding that there's a higher hierarchy of laws, which are called the laws of miracle. There is nothing miraculous about a miracle. Miracles are completely natural and have science to them. In the same idea, there is nothing natural about nature. Nature is completely miraculous, but we become used to it and we cease to see the miracle. So when a person is able to return to seeing the miracle of nature and the nature of miracle, then the boundaries of one world and the other world fall away to the point where a very evolved holy person can light vinegar in the same way that they're able to light a candle. So that becomes why the first day of Hanukkah is also a miracle. The mere fact that there is a nature in which oil could burn is miraculous. The natural nature of oil burning is a miracle. And that's what the sages were trying to point out. That of course number day 2, 3, 4, and so on were a miracle. That was a miracle in the classical sense. But wake up and see that even nature is a miracle. Even the fact that the oil burnt is a miracle. And to be able to take that idea further, in the Hanukkah, one of the practical laws of how to light a Hanukkah candle is that each day we add a candle. But we add them going from the right to the left, and when we light them, we light from the left to the right. This is because the right side always represents the side of kindness, while the left side always represents the side of strength. So therefore we are adding light, bringing the world of kindness into the world of strength, that kindness should be more powerful than strength. And then we light from the deepest side of the left, meaning we try to bring the light into the deepest darkness, and then to bring that light back to the source of its light. That's the process that we actually go through in lighting these candles. Now, interestingly enough, according to Hasidic thought, The holiest candle of all of the candles is the ninth candle. The ninth candle is called the shamish. The shamish in Hebrew means to serve, or the servant. It's the candle that's used to actually light the other candles. And in Jewish law, all of the candles must be on the same level except the servant candle. It could be higher, it could be lower, but it cannot be on the same level. Why? Because at the end of the day, it's the idea of one who is a true leader is truly a servant. That leadership should never be about ego. Leadership should never be about a person who wants to be a leader. Leadership should be about a person who is driven by the love of his people and by the love of life. And when that becomes the focus of a leader, then the leader knows how to cultivate the light of each person. Each person is a candle. Each person is their own wisdom. And it's not that we light a bonfire on Hanukkah where the light is not distinguished. We light each individual candle, but the culmination of the collective candles brings a great light into the world. Because a little light can dispel a light of darkness. But it's the challenge of the leader to know how to inspire each person to find their own unique light. And therefore, the leadership becomes called the servant, because the servitude is about being able to make the light permissible. Because we say that unless you have that ninth candle, it's not only the ninth candle, obviously, on the first night, it's the second candle, but it's called the ninth candle. Without that candle, the light of the Hanukkah candles are not permissible. Now, this is a kind of funny idea. Why should there be a concept of light, which the whole idea of bringing this light is to bring it into the world, and yet at the same time, the light should not be considered permissible? This is the basic difference between the menorah in the temple, which had 7 candelabras, and the Chanukiah, which we light on Hanukkah, which has 8. Because in esoteric teachings, we are taught that from the planet Earth up, so to speak, there are 7 different firmaments. There are 7 different levels of heaven. And those 7 levels, each one of them correlate again to the 7 candelabras of the menorah. So the function of the menorah, which was in the temple, if you look, very interesting, if you look at the structure of the housing unit that the menorah sat inside, normally the windows are built in a way at a slant to bring the outside light into the room. Here in the temple, the windows were the reverse. They were built to slant in order to bring the light inside from the menorah out into the world. And the Talmud says in a very esoteric way, we kind of joked about this before, we talked about planet Earth, and that is that when a soul is descending down into its mother's embryo, it goes through a hara. Because as it goes deeper, I don't know if you've ever gone deep sea diving, but as you get deeper and deeper in the water, it gets darker and darker and darker. And if you don't know where you are, it's really scary, because sometimes you might think you're swimming up to the surface. In fact, you might be going deeper down. So the soul goes through this hara of moving away from this unbelievable light, coming into what appears to be the epitome of darkness, our planet. You know, maybe I'll just digress for a minute, because this is a very deep Jewish idea that differs than other religions, and not at all to make any reflection on other religions, but at least to be aware of what the Jewish thought is. And that is, there are other people who have this idea that Earth is kind of a mid-ground. And it's like almost like the DMZs, we used to call it in Vietnam. There's the heaven forces on the top, and then there's the hell forces on the bottom. And they're kind of like the hell forces, I guess, got your ankles, and they're pulling you down, and the heaven like trying to pull you up. Actually reminds me of this joke. I don't know why, I probably shouldn't tell you, but I'll tell you quickly. You know the joke about the lawyer, the guy who comes home and he sees like a thief is stealing a cow, and the cow's already on the fence, and the guy remembers that possession is 9/10 of the law, so he runs, he's trying to pull the cow back onto his property, and the thief is pulling it out of the property, back and forth, and a lawyer comes along, sees it, and sits down and milks the cow. So, anyhow, let's just see if you're still awake. So there's kind of like this idea of like, you know, trying to pull the man or the woman between, oh, is he going to go to heaven, is he going to go to hell? But that's not at all the Jewish take. It's more like there's heaven, and then there's hell, and the lowest of the lowest is earth. Because Hell is not about pain. Hell is about a lack of consciousness. Death is about not knowing why you're living. So earth is a place where a person, God forbid, can suffer ultimate amnesia, have no idea why they are living like a vegetable, simply functioning, and never having realized the potential that was dormant inside of them. Hell is sort of like the Van Allen belt. It just merely burns off all the earthly material that was ingrained in a person's soul, cleansing them to return to the highest level, which is heaven. There is no idea, as far as Jews are concerned, of fallen angels who become the devil. In Judaism, the devil is actually considered one of the holiest of all angels. And all he is merely a servant to God, fulfilling from the side of God of justice and judgment, as opposed to the other angels that fulfill the service of God from the side of mercy and compassion. But is still a servant nonetheless. And so therefore everything between justice and compassion is the scales through which all of life is judged and happens. And this is the process of our free will within this world as we exist. Anyhow, so as that soul falls into this darkest of darkness, suddenly the light, esoterically speaking, of the menorah shines through the world. And the person realizes that even in this world, a person can find God. There's no such thing as being away from God, right? I think we talked about this a little bit last time. One of the great Rebbes, the Belzer Rebbe, once said, the distance between a non-religious Jew and a religious Jew is as far away as east to west. And so the question is, how far is east to west? Just turn around. There's no such thing as far. If you're facing east, you turn around, now you're facing west. So it's the same idea. There's no such thing as being far from God. It's nonsense. It's just being blocked from God. But the blockage is our own blockage. That's the beauty. We can take off the blockage. And so therefore it's that same idea that the menorah shows us that the light is there. If one is open to that light is there. Now, the Hanukkah candle, however, has 8 lights. So the 8th light actually comes from the highest of all worlds. It comes beyond time and space. And this we did speak about last time. This idea of beyond time and space is actually something that represents the concept of the infinity. And so therefore this concept of the light coming from the infinite, there was a great Hasidic Rebbe known as the Chazan Lublin. And he explained, actually maybe I'll say first how the American Indians say it. The American Indians had a tradition that the stars were created by a great Indian archer. When he saw that the moon was all alone in the sky and it was very dark, so he took his arrows and he shot holes in the fabric of the sky, and the light from the other side shined through, and that became known as the stars. The Chazan Lublin actually says this idea as well. He explains that really that the concept is that this is called the hidden light. In other words, in Kabbalah, the concept of the hidden light is when God created the world, he didn't really create light and darkness like we spoke about last time. He created light and he created hidden light, or Haganuz it's referred to. And that idea of the or Haganuz is also something here, which I kind of created this little image for, in that he says that the light of the menorah is actually a transcendental light that comes from the world of the infinite. And unless a person is able to perceive what it is that they see, that these are actually windows to the infinite, then on one level it might only appear to be candles. But what's really happening on the subliminal or on the subconscious level is that a person is really able to see throughout the universe, even into the infinity of the universe. And that is really the whole idea of what these candles are supposed to represent, is that idea of being able to pierce through the laws of nature. And this is why God said to Abraham, go outside and look at the stars. And the commentators explain that what God was showing Abraham, who is a master of astrology and astronomy, he said, if you look at the stars will tell you that you are not destined to have a child. And then God says, now look again. And you know, like those little guys got the 3 upside down cups and you're trying to follow which one has the bean in it. So God kind of does that. Says, now look at it. Now you see your children will be as abundant as the stars in the sky. Meaning that God was telling man that man does not need to be subjugated to the laws of nature. Man will live within the laws of nature, but man has the ability to circumvent that and to access into higher worlds and bring those higher worlds' blessings into this world. In biblical literature, this is found even in the stories of Moses and later by Joshua on classic moments of great battles where, according to our tradition, the sun actually stood still. The time suspended itself in order for the battle to reach to completion. Why? Because we are not subjugated to time. That's going to be the third part of the class, which we'll conclude on. But we're going to see this idea. But this is really the idea of being able to penetrate and to be able to see beyond all of that. So I'm going to show you another slide here, and then we're going to the third part of the class here, which is what we've led up to right now, which is the idea of the message. And I know that Hebrew, like Greek, might be a little alien. So I am going to try to walk you through this, but I think that it was kind of important to sort of see the Hebrew so we can understand what it was that was really going on. There were three major decrees that the Syrian Greeks made against the Jews. They prohibited the Jews from observing the Shabbat. They prohibited the Jewish men from performing circumcision. And they also prohibited the Jewish court from sanctifying the new moon. Now it's interesting because in Hebrew, the word for Shabbat begins with the letter Shin. The word for circumcision, Milah, begins with the letter Mem. And the word which is used in Talmudic language for the blessing of the new moon, Ner, which also means candle, begins with the letter Nun. And these three letters, Shin, Mem, Nun, are the Hebrew letters for the word oil, shemen. So that it was very appropriate that the miracle of Hanukkah should actually come through oil. We're going to end the class on to why specifically. But this idea of it coming through oil represents because these were the three primary issues that the Assyrian Greeks tried to close up among the Jews. Why? Because they said, you know, it's very nice if you want to take a day and chill out and rest. But to say that the actual nature of one day is any different than any other day in the week, because in traditional Judaism, a person who intentionally violates the Sabbath, of course, this requires witnesses and acknowledgement of the punishment, etc., but ultimately, the violation of the Shabbat carries with it, in classical biblical time, a death penalty. So they said, are you out of your mind? I mean, fine, it's Sunday, you know, chill out, do whatever you want, that's fine. You need a day, you break from work. But don't tell me that there's something different in the day itself intrinsically. And by Mila, the same idea. I mean, we know what the Greek theater was like, we know what Greek sport was like, and so on. They said that circumcision was no different than if you circumcise the guy's nose. It was basically a mutilation of the body. The body is art. The body is beautiful as it is. And the circumcision of the body mutilates the perfect body. And the last thing they said, which they felt was totally ludicrous, was what the Jews came along and said, that when the court implemented or instituted that it was now the new month, even if astrologically it could be proven that they had made a mistake, it didn't matter. Because God would rearrange the stars and the planets to follow what the court had said. Similar to the story we spoke about last time, where the rabbis stood up to God and said, God, mind your own business. This has nothing to do with you. So the Jewish answer to this was very different. The Jewish answer is that the Shabbat reminds us that God created the universe. And that Shabbat does not come from within this world, as we explained last class when we talked about the Star of David. It's not one of the 6 outer points of the star that represents the idea of the 6 days of the work. It comes from the higher world down through the middle, feeding those other 6 days. Again, like the menorah, it's the middle candle which feeds the wisdom to the other 6 candles, on three on each side. And so therefore, the idea of the Shabbat is, yes, its fabric, its fundamental nature is completely different than the rest of the weeks. In other words, time has substance, and the substance has character. And thus, the character of the substance of Shabbat is intrinsically different than the other 6 days of the week. Circumcision, this is the whole idea of creation. In the Bible, when it says, God says, let us make man, according to many commentators, he was talking to man. He says, listen, man, I'm going to give you everything you need, a respiratory system, a vascular system, oxygen in the air, food, everything you need. I'll give it to you. The only thing I can't give you is for you to become a man, to be a mensch, to be a human being who controls themselves, does not get angry, is not violent, becomes elevated, becomes spiritual, brings light into the world. I can't do that for you, because if I do that for you, you're a robot. But if you want to be a man, you have to choose to be a human. And therefore, the circumcision, which represents that part, especially of the male, as opposed to the evolved female, the male who could be so driven and so distracted through an egotistical expression of his sexual drives, has to be able to make that, more than anything, into the holiest of the holies. And therefore, that becomes a sacred item, rather than something which could be used to desecrate the character of the human being and the fabric of society. And finally, on the last level of that partnership, is that the partnership is not only in each individual, but it's the collective individuals that become known as society. And therefore, the society is that we are given this world in order to show God. I think I did mention this last time. One of my favorite quotes is, who we are is a gift from God, but who we become is our gift to God. So therefore, our gift to God is to show God that we can even run the laws of nature, i.e. determining when the new moon is. And we will run them in a way where all laws will be utilized in the benefit of mankind, literally becoming mankind, becoming kind in how we live and exist with each other. This was rooted, this difference in understanding is rooted between the very idea, oops, sorry, so you can just advance here, yeah. This might look like some kind of a Greek harmonica, but it's actually a Hebrew word which spells the word Greek. The smallest letter over here is the letter Yud, the middle letter is the letter Vav, and this letter is a nun, but a nun sofit. It's a nun that appears when it's used at the end of a word, and it would be pronounced Yavan, Yavan, and Yavan means Greece. Now, what this represents is a very interesting idea. I put the little line here in order to see what a baseline would look as if you were writing Hebrew. So the interesting thing about what you notice immediately is that this letter does not come down to the baseline, and this letter actually goes through the baseline, goes under the baseline. And of course, this one comes right to the baseline. So what the concept of Yavan represents from Jewish thought is the concept behind all societies. They begin with a very beautiful concept. There's something true about everything, whether it's democracy or communism. Even though we may have our personal bias, every ism, every society, every culture has in it a piece of divine wisdom, and it's for real. What happens, unfortunately, often is that it goes through the cyclic process of everything in this world. Everything goes up and everything comes down. So the next phase is the Vav. The Vav is the idea of taking the concept and bringing it down into this world. So many times when it comes to the human participation in a very lofty idea, when it becomes practical, it may come into the world, it may exist in the world, but ultimately it will never truly express the thought that was here. And as time will pass, it will be buried in this world. It will be lost in time and space. It will be a civilization, the Babylonian, the Mesopotamian, the Greeks, the Romans, you name it. They will all have their moment, like Mark Twain writes about, under the sun, and they will all eventually disappear. However, the difference between the word Greek and the word Zion, which is the Jerusalem center of it all, is that the word Zion includes the same process, that the Jewish nation does go through the same process as everybody else goes through. But the difference becomes this letter. This letter, which is the tzadi, is connected to the word tzaddik, which means the holy one or the righteous person. Now, the idea of a righteous person is not about being a saint. That's not us. Righteous people make mistakes. Righteous people sin. Righteous people fall. Well, if that's the case, how are they righteous? because they get up, because they overcome it, because they are able to turn their mistakes into milestones to allow them to grow beyond that, because we are organic. We are not inanimate, we are animate. And therefore, because we will make mistakes, since our inner desire is to reach holiness and to reach our true greatness within ourselves, we will never surrender in the face of failure, but we will learn from our failure in order to be able to once again start over. And that eternal desire to always grow again is all rooted at the idea of that little flask of oil, as we spoke about before, inside of us. That flask is the gateway to the infinite soul that lives within the finite body. And so therefore, rather than merely experience that where all society happens, the Jewish nation has this tendency to continually, even if it has to go through the fires of a Holocaust, can rebuild itself and regenerate itself for generation after generation after generation. And this is what I said before, why the miracle of Hanukkah happened through the oil. Because the idea of the oil is that no matter how far under the water the oil is, it will always rise to the surface. Wisdom and light and goodness will ultimately resolve itself. The Jews appreciate the idea of yin-yang, but they do not see yin-yang as an eternal balance. They see yin-yang as a finite expression of life in a temporary world, but ultimately it will be the light that will resolve itself and bring the world to a true harmony. And that's our vision. Our vision for Zion is that there will be a third temple, but it won't be like the Temple Mount today, where Jews aren't even allowed to pray on our own Temple Mount, but rather it will be a temple where all people together, regardless of who they are, because we're all made by the same Creator, and therefore we are all equally loved by the same Creator. The vision which came from the book of Ezekiel, says that the third temple's function is not about Jewish nationalism. It's about world unity. It's about creating a vehicle through which all people can rise together and bring a vision of real peace into the world that we all long for. And that really is the message of Hanukkah, that no matter how dark the winter gets, no matter how much darkness there is in the world, a little teeny candle, a little light can dispel a lot of darkness. And this is a very important lesson, and I'll stop on this lesson, because a lot of times when we look at the darkness in this world, we say, what can I do? I'm helpless. I mean, nobody's calling me from the UN asking me what to do. I'm helpless. Wrong. You're not helpless. You have in you your candle. And if you light your candle, it will light the candles of the people around you. And when your candles are lit, the community's candles, it will continue and continue and continue. And you know what? Even if, God forbid, it's not the right time, and that light of each one of those candles doesn't bring about the full fruition of the light, it doesn't matter. Because again, we're not Greeks. We don't believe in Atlas. We don't believe in carrying the world on our shoulders. God is not going to ask us about whether or not the world reached its full resolution or not. It's only going to ask us, did we carry our own shoulders? Did we at least put the light that we had into the world? The results are not in our hands, but the ability to do something, to make that effort, to light that little Hanukkah candle in the middle of all of that darkness is the beginning of bringing the world redemption and bringing us all together. So I hope you enjoyed the class tonight, or I know it's day over there, but it's night over here. And I just wanted to bless you.